Good afternoon and welcome to Good Journeys Tarot. I'm Rosemary, and today we are going to be talking about the Magician in our 78 cards in 78 weeks. Um, I actually was kind of anticipating this card coming up. It's interesting how things just seem to align as I'm working through the cards because I am pulling them at random. Um, and I want to ask you guys to please let me know when I make mistakes. Okay. Last week I was talking about Mother's Day and whether or not to do a broadcast. And what I did, I referred to Mother's Day as being 2 weeks from now. And up until yesterday, I thought it was 2 weeks from now. So my mom didn't get a card. So yeah, so I texted her this morning. I'll call her this afternoon. But yeah, if you catch me making a mistake, let me know. I like constructive criticism. I like to be aware of things that I do that are wrong, so that I can improve. Well, let's just jump right into the Magician and see who's here. All right, we've got Hannah, Dancing Soul Sister, and we've got Amy from Strength Reverse. Thank you for being here and on time. I have to tease Amy because the last several weeks she's like, "Oh, I almost forgot." As always, I'm going to start by looking at some cards from my decks. I want to start by looking at three cards that I just really have never cared for, and those are cards which depict the Magician as the juggler. Now, you'll recall when I talked about the Fool, I'm not a fan of the Fool as a jester, as we've seen in some decks. In some decks, like the Goblin Tarot or the Hearts and Hands or the Sassorabito, we see the Magician as an entertainer, a juggler, as it were, as it's been called in some older decks, that person who is out there to deceive you and entertain you. And I'm just not really inclined to work with those images because I feel like that's the shadow side of this card, not so much the truth behind the Magician. So I'm going to set those aside for now. Those are ones that I just am not on board with. And that happens with some of the major arcana. You know, there are cards that have been depicted in multiple different ways over time, and some of them speak more true to our understanding of the cards today than others. Um, Many cards will draw on the Smith-Waite imagery. And so we end up with the Magician holding a wand and then the four suits represented on the table. One of the things that has bothered me for many years is that there are two wands in this image. And I realized the idea was that, you know, this is the Magician manifesting their power. And then these are the symbols of the tarot cards, tarot suits. However, if I'm standing at an altar or table and I'm working with my tools like this, I'm only going to have one wand. I don't want there to be any confusion. I mean, even though I have more than one wand, I only work with one wand if I'm doing any kind of ritual, right? And so that's always kind of bugged me a little bit. You get in decks today, kind of the same idea, the four suits represented with a magician and just arranged a little bit differently. I think this is probably one of my favorites. I love that it's outdoors. This is from the Slow Tarot. It incorporates all of the symbols and whatnot from the Smith-Waite, and yet is distinctively its own. There's a collage deck, which basically has the four elements and the Magician. Here is our Ellis deck, which he has an arm for every suit that he's holding. So he doesn't actually have a table. He has all of the tools in his hands, which is an idea that the Magician does evoke, the idea that everything is at our disposal. And here is the Spacious Tarot, in which it's simply the symbols for the suits. In the original black and white version of the Spirit Keepers Tarot, Benabel Wynn simply used the Ouroboros, as above, so below, and then symbols of the four elements in the corners, making this resemble in many ways the Wheel or the World card, as the Magus of Power, as the Golden Dawn calls it, is connected with the divine. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we look at the imagery in the card. In the more recent deck, there actually is a priest or priestess that is in the image as well. Now, some decks move towards a more, I guess, what I call witchy or pagan viewpoint, rather than the ritual of, say, the Golden Dawn that we see in a lot of them. This is the Lost Hollow. I do love this image. Something about the deer head there on the magician. And of course, you'll see our crow there, that crow appearing in all the major arcana as the fool traveling the journey. Here is the Wild Wood, which has renamed it to Shaman, which we see in many pagan-inspired and witchy decks. Nowadays, even they may call it the priest versus, say, the magician or the magus, or a shaman. You haven't seen this deck a lot because it is one that is its own system. And I tried studying it, but I couldn't relate to that system. So I don't work with it as much as I had anticipated, though it has some lovely images. Some of them just are completely different than the traditional decks that we're used to, the Thoth, the TDM, and the Smith Waite. The next two cards are actually some of my favorites, even before I owned them. I just love this idea of wearing a headdress, of deer horns. I actually have a set of deer antlers that I got from my father. And I have been wanting to make a headdress with it, but none of my friends who know how to do that type of thing have been available really to interact with over the last several years. And so I do really like this image. This is the Javel Noir, which is out of print now. And then, of course, the Robin Wood adopts that same kind of feeling that I really loved. And so for something a little bit more modern and yet connected to the witch, that kind of a kitchen witch idea, here is the Pocket of Peers. This is actually Jamie Sawyer's mother in her kitchen, and you'll see there all of the various tools in the background. Now, these last four are completely different. So they don't relate to those tools in any way, really. They focus more on the manifestation of power and of magic, so to speak. And so we get something like this: a hand and light. This is the Lightworkers deck, which I love the images. These were public domain images that they're actually images they purchased from a website. But you also see this in the Bonestone and Earthflash, where she talks about the gray one. There's just no way you can't relate this to Gandalf when you read her guidebook and when you see this image. The Lily White also embraces this type of idea of manifestation of power or energy. And then finally, our Lightworkers deck. And so you do get some variables there in how the card is depicted. It's not always just the magician with their elemental representations. So let's talk a little bit about the Magus of Power, as the Golden Dawn calls it. One of the things that has proven most difficult in studying the magician is that There is a huge disagreement in the tarot community about the elemental association of this card. So much so that in many books, it'll say it's either air or it's earth. And but some do take a stand. Um, I've actually, as I studied the elements related to the major arcana, numerous times tried to go through and look at them as I assigned them. And I'll show you what I did. It's another one of my fancy little spreadsheets. Um, and I just color coded them yellow, green, blue, and red for their elemental dignities. There are two cards which are controversial, right? The Magician that we've been talking about and Judgment. And the approach that I took as I think about the elemental dignities of those two has been that I think there should be a balance within the major arcana, right? And between the active and the passive, between the receptive and the dominant, between the four elements, there are 22. And so for me, it just makes sense that 11 would be water and earth, and 11 would be air and fire. And depending on how you assign Judgment and you assign the Magician, you can reach it. There is a balance to that you can find there. And one of the things about this card, which Amy has just hinted on, is that before I started studying what other people said and what books said, I always assumed the Magician was fire. I always associated it with fire just because of that power, that energy that is associated with this card. And so it's not a stretch for me to say air versus earth, because I've always seen it as a more active energy and more dominant type of energy than, say, a passive or receptive type of energy that we might associate with water or earth. And so I originally had come down on the side of earth. And now, as I've studied it this week, I'm back to air. And because the way that I have the elements assigned in my mind and in the spreadsheet, it balances the energy, which is what I'm looking for as I'm working with the tarots, trying to figure out their dignities. So that I think everything needs to balance. Let's see. Right. And so that's another thing. As you look at the tree of life, there's this idea that it could be fire because of where it lands on the paths. Um, but I did end up assigning it to air for multiple reasons. But let's look at it real quick. So in Bidabel Wynn's book, she actually says at the beginning of it, whoops, it actually says it could be earth or it could be air. But then she actually makes this long paragraph here outlining why she believes it's earth and actually related to yin energy or the feminine versus saying the masculine or the active energy. And while, she's perfectly rational in the way that she speaks, when I think about this card, I look at everything, right? So I always look at the Golden Dawn Association, and then I look at the various correspondences when I'm trying to work it out for myself. And as Hannah's pointed out, it's associated with Mercury. Now, in Benabel's book, she talks about Mercury and its elemental association. The planet is Earth, which didn't make any sense to me, because in other books it's actually associated with air, and I think that might be part of the confusion with between air and earth is which astrological correspondence you're using. However, Mercury is associated with communication, logic, intellect, and communication, which is what our air suit is associated with, which is why I tend to lean towards it being associated with air. And that's kind of the point that is made in this book, Tarot and Astrology. Um, so that's just a little bit of rambling about the elemental association. I don't know that that really matters. It doesn't really impact the meaning of our card or the imagery of our card specifically, but it does help to understand the card, right? Every little bit of information that we can get, and of course, Mercury, as a god, was a messenger, right? Which would be associated with air. Another thing is that Mercury alchemically is the element of air, right? So your sulfur is fire and salt is earth. Um, and so it just makes more sense to me that it's air rather than earth. But and the way that I've outlined it in my little spreadsheet, it actually balances everything. We'll have to talk about judgment when we get to judgment, because judgment is another one where there is this conflict about which element the card is associated with. So let's talk a little bit about meanings. This card, obviously, we tend to think immediately of manifestation. We think of mastery of things, but it also involves power. It involves skill, action, concentration, resourcefulness, ingenuity. All of those things come together. One of the things that is mentioned repeatedly in book after book, and even on the face of some of the cards that we look at, is this idea of as above, so below. The magician being a conduit for divine power or influence on the earth. The idea being that from a Golden Dawn and Rosicrucian perspective is that the magician is the one who draws on their highest self, their highest consciousness, their divine self, to bring, the truth, the um uh the action of the divine into the world. And so they're a conduit, i.e., the hand pointing to the sky and to the earth, the energy flowing through them to produce um, what's for the highest good, right? And so self confidence is definitely something that we see there in this card, even if you don't read it from a the perspective of the Golden Dawn or the Rosicrucians. It's definitely there in the way that the magician is positioned. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the shadow side of this card. What happens in the shadow side? Well, basically, the idea of the shadow side of this card for me is that um, your motivation is what makes it the shadow side. It is whether your motivation is for the common good or if your motivation is for yourself. And when your motivation is for yourself, you use those powers and those things that you have come to master, and you use your confidence and whatnot to manipulate situations and other people. You may be a trickster or dishonest, i.e., what the juggler denotes in some of the older decks. There's also the idea of a lack of focus or wasted potential. You're not living up to your ability and your skill. I want to talk about some of the symbols in here. Of course, there are the rose and lilies, which several books will make a lot of deal about because these are supposedly, specific symbols to be repeated throughout the deck. The roses being about the divine presence, the lilies being about, I want to say innocence, but it's not necessarily innocence. It's that that kind of human connection or understanding or consciousness that's connected with the divine. Okay, so we bring divine truth or divine action into the world. Um, the lemniscate here and this snake belt, which is equated with the Ouroboros, to me, those are the same thing, right? I mean, they're both symbols of that infinite knowledge or wisdom, that energy, that spirit, or enlightenment that is existing and present. If you have a different way of looking at that, let me know, because that was one of the things I kind of struggled with. I'm like, why both? Why the snake and the lemniscate? Oddly enough, I finally learned to spell lemniscate this week because I'd always spelled it Lamiscate, Lamiscate, which it comes up if you Google it that way, but so they obviously know what my misspelling is, right? Um, yeah. So let's look at my card that I created and what I did there. Open up. Let's see. Today. All right. Go to here. Stop the screen share. Sharing. All right. So this was the first draft of what I did, and I'll tell you the things that I'm having to focus on to really try to get right on this card that are bugging me are the altar tile and the shadow on the coffee cup, because the coffee cup is actually the same one that is in our Nine of Wands. I've just recolored it blue instead of red. And when I did, it recolored the shadow. So I'm having to draw the shadow in by hand, so to speak, on my computer, which is a little taxing and is taking me a little while to get right. But the altar tile, I've struggled with making it three-dimensional and also trying to figure out how to do it, because in my mind I wanted, my rose cross on it because it's the way I've always pictured it in my brain. uh, but then traditionally, we've always had a pentacle on it, and so I started playing with it, and oops, I actually did it with the pentacle. I tried like using the cross as like on the table, say like an altar cloth. But I did end up going with this more three-dimensional looking altar tile, which I think works better than this. I even tried putting that symbol in white or green on the coin so that it was part of the coin. Although I think for most people, the pentacle makes would be more recognizable than say this symbol. Though by the time they look at my deck enough, they're going to see it over and over again. So let's look at this one. So this is currently the version that I posted, which has the symbol in color on the tile. What are your thoughts? What do you like? What tile works for you, or you think works? Let's see. Using pattern. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely all the things that we were talking about earlier. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, okay. So I have no idea which one was number 4. So let me get back. So let's see. Let me put them all up here. So which one is it, Amy, now that you're seeing all 5 of them? Is it still number 4? Is it the one with the like altar cloth and the pentacle, or the lighter pentacle? What? Huh? Not sure which one that is. The lighter pentacle. So it's one of these. Let's see. Um, so we'll take those out. So which one of these is it? Okay. So you like it with that kind, with my symbol on the table is like an altar cloth kind of thing. Yeah. Okay. One, two. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, I may use that one. This is one of the cards where I felt like my Rose Cross needed to be in the picture somewhere, but I couldn't decide. This one here resembles more what my actual altar space looks like. Because I actually have it laid out like that Rose Cross, but I actually have, a altar tile that is a pentacle on there. So yeah. Um, So I want to wish all of you who are mothers happy Mother's Day. And before we go, we'll draw our card that we're going to be doing in 2 weeks. Um, but let's talk just briefly about some of the Tree of Life correspondences. This card is associated with the Hebrew letter Bet, and Bet is house. And so the way I've come to think of that is that the magician has a framework in which to operate and to manifest in the physical world that which is led by spirit, right? Um, they're not just they're not making it up as they go necessarily. They actually have the tools, they have the framework in which to operate. So regardless of whether that framework is like the Golden Dawn framework or that is a more Wiccan framework, like say the Robin Wood, there is a framework in which the magician is operating. Um, the On the Tree of Life, this is path 12, and this is where Keter, the very top, the first Sephira, runs to Benai, which is that. Um, Sephira of creativity, basically. And so it's connecting that divine power, that source, with creative energy. And so you kind of get this idea of your highest consciousness. Okay. So you're doing what is right, what is necessary. You're connecting what is spirit led to the earthly realm, manifesting it here. So let's do this. I'll unshare that. Next week, I will not be here. I am I at a convention and I'll be teaching a class there, assuming that I finish getting it ready because I've been putting it off, waiting for a deck to arrive that doesn't look like it's going to arrive, unfortunately. Um, it looks like I might finally get the deck that was supposed to be here in February and got lost in the mail. We'll see what happens with that. But next week, I should hopefully have a video for you on Sunday, so you don't have to miss my smiling face. I'm going to do a VR to Mags Black's Tag Tarot Nerd, which I saw on Kelly Bear's channel yesterday, and have that up for you so you don't have to miss a week with me. And then the next week, we will work this card. Hopefully, someone will want to join me. Oh my. This is another heavy one. This is another big one. This is a card that I have been thinking to myself for 2 weeks as I drew the magician. How would I ever depict this card? What would I even put in this card? And so I yeah, I really hope that someone will join me in 2 weeks as we talk about death. That card of transformation, endings, um, and and look at that. There are some interesting depictions of death out there. Um, some, the reaper with the sickle. There are those that are more like the grieving loved one left behind, which is an interesting but very different feel than you get with, say, the Golden Dawn imagery, or even the Terre de Marseille, where it's a skeleton with the scythe. So, yes, death. All right. So, if you want to join me in 2 weeks talking about death, please do let me know. And until next time, everyone, good journeys. I know it's a short one today. This will just give you more time to see your moms if you are able to do so, and to spend time on the phone with them, which I'm going to have to do since I didn't get my card out. I probably would have done it either way. But until next time, everyone, good journeys. Take care.